Ethan!
He was just an innocent toddler, unsteady on his feet, full of life and smiling.
Got to Ethan!
But just a few short months after this video was taken, Ethan Ives Griffiths was dead. His final days were marked not by love, but by the unthinkable cruelty of those meant to protect him.
Is the patient awake?
I don't know, it's my grandson. He's just...
Can you check for me if he's awake?
On October 4th, 2019, 22-year-old Shanice Ives carried a small bundle of clothes through the front door of her parents' home. Her little boy, Ethan, tugged at her sleeve, humming a song he had just made up, unaware that the world around him was about to change. Ethan was just 2 years old. 2 years. That visit was the beginning of the most tragic case of child abuse in recent years. Cases involving children rewrite the emotional rules. This one rewrites it page by page. This is the most difficult to bear. In every neighborhood, in every city, there's a child whose voice goes unheard. Some are quiet, some are overlooked, but all depend on those around them. The real question is, will we listen before it's too late? Before we begin tonight, I want to speak to you parent to parent, adult to adult, human to human. Because after everything you will hear today, after walking through every moment this child never survived, there's a truth we can't escape. Children don't get to choose the adults who raise them. They don't get to choose the homes they grow up in. They don't get to leave when things become unbearable. They can't run, can't protect themselves, can't fight back. A child's entire world, their entire future, sits in the hands of the grown-ups around them. And when those hands fail them, the child doesn't get a second chance. Some of you watching right now are parents. Some are grandparents. Some are teachers. Some are simply people with a soft spot for children, the kind of heart that aches when you see a little one in pain. And I know that there are going to be moments in this story when you have to stop, look away, breathe through it. Moments that will make you imagine your own child, your niece, your nephew, the kid next door. Moments that will make you think, what if someone had stepped in sooner? What if someone had spoken up? Most of the cases we tell here, they never make it to Netflix. Not because they aren't important, but because they are too real, too raw, too heartbreaking for platforms that want polished tragedy instead of the painful truth. But these children deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told with care, with dignity, with the seriousness they were denied in life. And that's why we do what we do. Every episode on this channel takes hours, days of digging, verifying, cross-checking, and piecing together the reality behind the headlines. Because if these children never had a voice, the least we can do is make sure their silence is heard. At the end, if tonight shook you, if it reminded you to hug your child a little tighter, if it made you look at the kids in your life with more tenderness, more awareness, more gratitude, then I ask you, from my heart to yours, please subscribe. Not for entertainment, not for numbers, but because there is another child out there right now whose story risks being forgotten. Another case no one is telling. Another little life slipping through the cracks. Share this video so we could reach more audiences and perhaps help some who need the information we will share here today. Be sure to comment, as your insightful thoughts could be just what a child out there may depend on for survival. And maybe, by staying here with us, by listening, by caring, you help bring just a little more light to the places where children are still hurting. Thank you for watching, for feeling, for remembering. And wherever you are tonight, please check on a child you love. Shanice had nowhere else to go. Her breakup with William Griffith, Ethan's father, had left her exhausted, unemployed, and desperate. William worked long shifts at a local warehouse, trying to maintain visitation, but money and time were scarce. Shanice needed support. She needed safety. She needed a roof over her son's head, even if it meant returning to the house that had shaped her childhood, a house filled with rules, tension, and history. Michael and Karen Ives had always run a strict household. Michael's voice carried authority, cutting through the walls even when he wasn't physically present. Karen, gentle yet firm, believed in structure and routines, often reminding Shanice that discipline was a form of love. But years of heavy-handed control had left scars, and Shanice remembered the nights doors slammed, arguments spilling into the street, and the moments she'd hidden in corners, wondering if any adult could truly be trusted. This was supposed to be temporary, a few weeks, until she found work, until she could save money, until she could breathe. She told herself she could protect Ethan here. She reminded herself of all the nights she had survived as a child. But even in that first hour, subtle unease pressed against her chest. Karen greeted them with warm food and soft encouragement. But Michael's eyes lingered a moment too long on Ethan, a quiet calculation in his gaze. The little boy laughed at a joke his mother made, unaware of the weight of his new surroundings. Shanice traced the pattern on his cartoon sheets at bedtime, praying that the ordinary warmth of a home could shield him. Within days, small fractures appeared. Michael's tone shifted over trivial things: a spilled cup, a delayed chore, Ethan's natural energy. Karen softened the edges, but the undercurrent of tension grew. Shanice felt herself walking on eggshells, each movement measured, each word carefully chosen. The laughter in the house now mingled with an unspoken fear. Ethan remained blissfully unaware, but Shanice noticed. She remembered the sharpness in her father's voice from years before, and how quickly a household could tilt from normal to tense. This was the home she returned to for stability, for support, for safety. And yet, the shadows of the past crept in quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by Shanice. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she could handle it. But the truth, one she wouldn't yet admit, was that every day she stayed, she stepped closer to a time when ordinary warmth would give way to a moment no one could undo. Within 7 weeks, Ethan would be gone. The house on Oakwood Lane looked ordinary from the street. Faded paint chipped at the edges of the porch, and a swing in the yard swayed slightly in the breeze, despite no child playing on it. Toys were scattered, tricycles upturned, a small basketball hoop lying in the weeds, silent witnesses to the tension inside. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the calm facade outside. Ethan's older siblings, Aaliyah, 7, and Malachi, 9, moved quietly from room to room. Even in their small acts, whispered conversations, careful footsteps, they seemed to sense the invisible rules of the house. They had learned, early on, to watch and wait, to speak only when necessary, to anticipate reactions that could turn sharp in an instant. Ethan, blissfully unaware, followed routines he was told, copying his siblings' quiet vigilance without understanding why. Michael's voice could cut through the house like a blade. A spilled cup, a squeal from the baby, even laughter at the wrong moment, and his frustration would surface, measured but unmistakable. Karen Ives, in contrast, had learned to step back. Her touch was minimal, her affection rare and cautious. She moved through the rooms like a shadow, nodding, correcting, instructing, but never truly comforting. The contrast between Michael's intensity and Karen's withdrawal created an invisible tension that Shanice carried with her everywhere she went. Shanice often retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, a temporary sanctuary where she could breathe and watch her children from a safe distance. She juggled the impossible, managing Ethan's needs, helping the older children, and trying to maintain the fragile peace of the household. Every word she spoke was calculated, every movement measured. The house had drawn attention before. Social services had monitored the family due to past concerns, minor injuries explained away, delayed medical visits, and signs of emotional strain in the children. Workers would arrive for scheduled checks, only to be met with rehearsed answers, polite compliance, and a tidy house that passed inspection. Shanice had learned to present the right version. Michael and Karen nodded in unison, and the children played their roles perfectly. It was an invisible performance, one designed to hide the cracks beneath the surface. Yet, there were still fleeting moments of warmth. A pancake breakfast in the sunlit kitchen, a small joke that drew laughter, Karen tucking Ethan into bed and brushing his hair softly for a rare few seconds. These moments masked the tension, like sunlight through clouds, offering brief respite, but they were fragile, fleeting, and deceptive. Even the neighbors, seeing only the bright morning light and the scattered toys, had no way of knowing the silent fear threading through the rooms. Within these walls, ordinary appearances concealed extraordinary stress. Every glance, every measured step, every whispered word was part of a careful dance. Shanice watched her children, felt their anxiety, and tried to protect them, but the undercurrent of pressure grew stronger each day. The house seemed normal, safe, comforting, but inside, it was a house brimming with tension, a place where fear and fatigue coexisted with love, waiting for the moment when appearances would no longer be enough. Ethan Ives Griffiths was a boy the system was meant to see, protect, and safeguard. On paper, he was on the Child Protection Register, a young life flag for regular checks, monitored by social workers and health visitors every 10 days. In theory, there were eyes on him, eyes trained to notice bruises, weight loss, or any subtle sign of distress. In practice, those eyes often saw what they were shown, not what truly lay beneath the surface. On July 22, 2021, a social worker arrived at the Ives home, notebook in hand, ready to assess Ethan's well-being. Shanice answered the door, calm, rehearsed. "He's napping," she said. Inside, Ethan lay on the small bed, his tiny chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. He glanced at the door, sensing the interruption, fingers fiddling with a blanket, a quiet worry in his eyes. The social worker lingered, knocking gently, peering past half-drawn curtains, noting the faint odor of breakfast still lingering in the air. 45 minutes passed. The worker left, unable to see the boy, unable to confirm that he was safe. 11 days later, a health visitor attempted another check. "We're just here to see how he's doing," she said. No answer. Phone calls went unanswered. Shanice had a reason for everything. Between meals, he's resting. COVID restrictions make it difficult. Each explanation was believable enough to maintain appearances, but each excuse created a small, invisible gap in protection. Every gap, no matter how minor, was another thread in a fragile net that was slowly unraveling. Within those walls, small signs of trouble were visible to anyone paying close attention. Ethan's cheeks were hollowing, his energy fading. He avoided his grandfather's gaze, stayed close to his mother, mimicking his older siblings' careful movements. Malachi flinched when footsteps grew sharp. Aaliyah's smile faltered as she navigated her father's moods. Shanice noticed too, her stomach knotting with helplessness. She wanted to shield them all, but she was trapped, caught between the authority of her parents and the procedures of a system that couldn't penetrate the rehearsed normalcy of the house. And yet, the house maintained its appearance of order. Toys left in place, walls uncluttered, furniture tidy enough to pass inspections. On the outside, it looked ordinary calm, but inside, time and attention were slipping through the cracks. Every missed visit, every denied entry, every unanswered call compounded the risk, and each day Ethan grew weaker, more vulnerable, closer to the breaking point. The professionals documented diligently, but documentation alone could not protect a child whose world was carefully masked by routine and excuse. There were rare glimpses of what normal life should have looked like. A shared breakfast with laughter, Shanice tucking Ethan into bed with a gentle kiss, Karen briefly brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Those moments, brief and fragile, hinted at warmth, at potential love, yet they were fleeting, and they left the professionals no clue of the sustained harm occurring just beyond their view. The tragedy was quietly building, unnoticed by the very system designed to prevent it. What appeared as ordinary obstacles, a napping child, a closed door, a polite excuse, became fatal gaps. By August 16, 2021, the cumulative weight of these small failures, combined with the actions of those meant to care for him, would culminate in a loss that no procedure, no social worker, and no record could undo. Detective Cameron Lee had seen countless horrors over 15 years on the force, but nothing prepared him for the hours of CCTV from the IVES home. Rows of monitors hummed, flickering images revealing the mundane. Empty streets, neighbors walking dogs, children playing in yards. But the mundane was deceptive. Somewhere in this footage was the truth about Ethan, the 2-year-old boy whose life hung by threads unseen. On August 4th, 2021, the moment arrived. Michael's eyes appeared on the screen, stepping into the garden. In his grip, Ethan dangled by one arm. His body was limp, legs swaying unnaturally, fingers brushing the uneven ground as if seeking something solid. There was no tenderness, no instinctive protection. Just a young child carried as though he were a package, an object to be moved with careless efficiency. Ethan's eyes were open, though unfocused. A flicker of awareness passed through him, an instinctive confusion, but no cry came. Perhaps he had learned silence was safer. Perhaps he had no strength left to resist. His small chest rose and fell unevenly, barely noticeable on the grainy footage, but Detective Lee saw it. Every frame was a record of suffering. The room around Lee was silent but heavy. Colleagues leaned forward, squinting at screens, fingers hovering over keyboards. A muffled gasp escaped one officer. Another shifted in their chair. Lee's own composure cracked, just briefly, as disbelief and shock pressed in. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath, trying to separate professional duty from visceral reaction. But even with experience, the image refused to leave him. The footage was pivotal. It wasn't merely a disturbing image. It crystallized the abuse in a single, undeniable act. Weeks of missed social worker visits, polite excuses, rehearsed stories, and superficial normalcy suddenly dissolved into clarity. Ethan was in danger every moment he was in that house. And yet, even with this evidence, questions lingered. What else had been captured, hidden in other angles, other hours of tape? How deep did the cruelty go beyond the camera lens? Detective Lee scribbled notes furiously, timestamps recorded, frames frozen, zoomed in. The team exchanged short murmurs, gestures of acknowledgement, brief glances of shared horror. But no one spoke the full truth aloud. The child's suffering had already been immense, and there was more to uncover. Each second of footage was a piece of a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight. Outside, the sun cast long shadows across the yard. Inside, the dim glow of monitors reflected on tense faces. A cup of cold coffee sat untouched, and the low hum of machinery filled the pauses between frames. Lee's mind raced. Could justice catch up before it was too late? Could this footage, this single glimpse of cruelty, lead them to fully understand what Ethan endured in the final weeks of his life? The answer was both urgent and terrifying. Every flick of the mouse, every frame studied, felt like peeling back a layer of darkness. Detective Lee knew that this first footage was only the beginning, a hint of what lay hidden behind the doors of the IVES household. And as he watched Ethan's small body swing helplessly in the garden, the haunting thought pressed. How much more had the boy suffered out of sight? August 6th, 2021. The garden outside the IVES home appeared ordinary at first glance. A few toys lay scattered, grass pressed into uneven lines, sunlight catching dust motes drifting in the air. But inside Detective Cameron Lee's office, the monitors revealed a hidden world. One of control, fear, and calculated cruelty. Ethan stood in the yard, tiny hands pressed firmly against his head. Minutes passed like hours. His legs trembled under the strain. A faint whimper escaped him, almost swallowed by the distant sounds of a dog barking and leaves rustling in the summer breeze. There was no one to comfort him, no soft voice, no hand to steady his fragile frame. Only the relentless gaze of Michael Ives, pacing nearby like a shadow of authority. A gesture, a prompt. An older sibling struck Ethan lightly on the head, unsure, hesitant, then with increasing boldness. Each movement reinforced a lesson Ethan could not yet understand. Compliance through fear, obedience through humiliation. Stress positions, isolation, public shame. They were weapons subtle yet devastating. Psychologists would later describe it as a calculated pattern to break a child's sense of safety and self. Karen Ives lingered in the background, her posture rigid, arms crossed, eyes deliberately turned away. She did nothing. Her inaction carried weight. Emotional neglect, when paired with active cruelty, becomes an invisible chain. In that moment, her silence was as loud as any strike, as damaging as any push or shove. She watched. She allowed. She became complicit. Inside the small office, Detective Lee leaned forward, jaw tight. Around him, colleagues shifted uneasily, murmuring under their breath, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. The room was dimly lit, the hum of monitors filling every pause. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat abandoned, forgotten. The tension was tangible, pressing against their ribs as each frame revealed another layer of Ethan's suffering. This was not an isolated act. This was a pattern, a rhythm of torment repeating day after day. Social worker visits missed, doors closed, excuses given, oversight avoided, all creating opportunities for sustained abuse. And in those quiet, sunlit moments captured on camera, the full weight of it became visible. The repetition, the orchestration, the shared silence of the adults. This was the story that had to be told. Yet, there were deceptive glimpses of normalcy. A sibling laughed elsewhere, chasing a ball, oblivious to the cruelty nearby. Birds landed on the fence, pecking at crumbs, indifferent to human suffering. These fleeting signs of life only made the darkness around Ethan sharper, the contrast starker. It reminded investigators of how ordinary the world can seem, even when extraordinary cruelty occurs within it. Every detail was logged, every timestamp noted, every frame frozen and studied. But even as they documented, Detective Lee knew this was just the beginning. The first footage had revealed a pattern, but the full extent of what Ethan endured remained hidden. The dread of what further evidence might reveal pressed on them, heavier than the summer air outside. August 7th, 2021. In the quiet Garden City, Flintshire, the world outside the Ives home seemed ordinary. Birds chirped in the morning sun. A neighbor watered her garden, unaware of the suffering just yards away. To anyone looking, life carried on as usual. But inside, Ethan was fading. His tiny frame grew thinner by the day. Cheeks once soft and rounded now appeared hollow. His limbs, so small and fragile, barely held him upright. The simplest movements, reaching for a toy, standing from a chair, left him trembling. Even his attempts to smile were weak, fleeting shadows of a 2-year-old's natural joy. Meals were scarce, tiny portions doled out at irregular intervals. Sometimes hours passed without food, leaving Ethan's stomach empty, gnawing, insistent. He would reach out to his siblings, silent eyes pleading. The older children noticed. "He's always hungry," one would later tell investigators, voice trembling. "Even when we had food, he barely got any." He kept asking, but nothing came. Detective Cameron Lee reviewed Ethan's medical notes and prior check-in reports. Every record told the same story. Missed appointments, overlooked growth charts, subtle signs dismissed. He scribbled observations in the dim light of his office, the hum of the monitors echoing the quiet dread he felt. "Look at these dates," he muttered, tracing the line of weight loss. "Each day counts. Each day matters." The decline didn't happen all at once. August 1st, he was already lighter than expected. August 3rd, he struggled to finish a small snack. By August 7th, even the briefest burst of play left him exhausted, chest rising and falling with labored effort. Each passing day was a step further into vulnerability. Each denied meal another brick in a wall of neglect. Ethan's inner world remained largely invisible, yet his gestures spoke volumes. He hesitated when his grandmother approached with a plate. He glanced toward his siblings, seeking comfort, reassurance, a small hand to hold. His eyes, wide and searching, betrayed confusion and fear. He did not understand why the food never came. He did not understand why safety and warmth were withheld. Neighbors remained blind to these signs. From the street, they saw laughter from older children, a swing moving in the breeze, an ordinary house holding ordinary lives. Few realized how carefully the family's private struggles masked desperation and cruelty. The facade of normalcy protected the hidden suffering within. Each observation, each note, each whispered sibling memory became part of a growing dossier for investigators. And yet, the worst was still to come. The rapid decline, subtle but relentless, was building toward a tragedy no one could yet fully comprehend. Detective Lee knew the pattern of neglect was accelerating, and with each passing day, Ethan was more vulnerable than the last. August 12, 2021, 3:04 p.m. The heat in Garden City clung to the air like a film, hanging thick over the row of homes along Mapleview Drive. On most afternoons, you could hear kids calling to each other across yards or doors slamming as families came and went. But on this day, outside the IVES house, there was nothing. No movement behind the curtains. No voices. No signs of routine. Social worker Denise Hall stepped out of her county-issued sedan, her paperwork balanced on one arm, her phone in her other hand. Hers was the kind of job where intuition often mattered just as much as training. And as soon as she approached the porch, she felt it, the sort of hush that doesn't come from peace, but from something withheld. She knocked once, then again, harder. She paused, tilting her head toward the side window. Nothing. No rustle of feet. No child's laughter. No adult whispering. "We're coming." She moved to the window near the living room, shielding her eyes to peer through the small gap between the curtains. It was too dark to make out faces or shapes, but she noticed something odd, a stack of unopened mail on the floor, just inside the door. It was the kind of detail that gets filed away in the back of a seasoned worker's mind. Denise knocked one more time, checked her watch, and waited longer than protocol required. With cases backed up across the city and staff thinning after COVID restrictions, every minute mattered. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After nearly 8 minutes on the porch, she slid her business card into the doorframe, took photos for documentation, and returned to her car. She told herself she'd be back tomorrow. She didn't know then how much that return would matter. August 13th, 3:17 p.m., same house. Same silence. Same drawn curtains. This time, Denise tried the side door as well, a habit she developed when families chose to selectively hear knocks. She listened carefully, hoping for any sign of life. The thump of small feet, a muffled voice, even the sound of a TV humming in another room. Nothing. She took a slow step backward, scanning the property. The trash bin near the curb hadn't been moved in 3 days. A half-finished bottle of soda sat on the railing, warm from the sun, and someone had turned the living room fan toward the window, as if trying to push air or smell out. That detail would only make sense later. Denise considered calling for a welfare assist from patrol, but she hesitated, not out of neglect, but out of experience. Families like the IVES often avoided contact out of embarrassment, not danger. And she had been trained, again and again, to avoid escalations unless there were unmistakable signs of immediate harm. So she followed protocol, noted the attempt, and stepped away. This would become one of the decisions she replayed in her mind for months, the kind that tightens the chest and refuses to let go. When investigators later retraced the timeline, they spread the case notes across an entire table. Red markers circled each missed check. Blue markers circled the excuses the family had given in prior weeks. Kids are sleeping. We're eating. We're at the store. Then there was a new detail. 3 days before the attempted visit on August 12th, Michael had withdrawn $180 in cash from a grocery store ATM. Small enough to be overlooked. Large enough to matter. It was the kind of withdrawal investigators later connected to patterns of avoidance. Gas money, supplies, or temporary lodging they hadn't yet discovered. A clue that seemed meaningless on paper, but would matter deeply soon. Inside the home, life had reached a breaking point. Ethan's crying had weakened to quiet whimpers that came and went like fading breaths. The older siblings kept their distance, unsure what they were allowed to do and too frightened to try. Shanice stayed in her room for hours at a time, and Michael, the one the household revolved around, had grown impatient with noise, with movement, with anything that required compassion. The house developed a rhythm of its own, a rhythm built on avoidance. Low voices, closed doors, the scraping of chairs instead of conversation, the sound of Ethan not crying hard enough for neighbors to notice. The decline wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, invisible to the world outside those windows. What made these 11 days so critical wasn't only what was happening, but the opportunities slipping away. On August 14th, a neighbor walked past the house and noticed the car parked slightly crooked, as if it had been pulled in quickly. She thought nothing of it at the time. On August 16th, a delivery driver knocked twice before giving up and leaving a package at the door. Another detail unnoticed. Another sign swallowed by the silence. By August 18th, no one had seen the children outdoors for nearly a week. And on the 19th, a relative sent a text message to Shanice. Haven't heard from y'all. Everything good. It was marked as read. No reply ever came. Underscore when Detective Cameron Lee studied the same timeline months later. He placed 3 large pins on a map. August 12th, first missed visit. August 13th, second missed visit. August 15th, ATM withdrawal confirmed. Then he leaned back and said quietly, "This is when everything started collapsing." It wasn't just the abuse, it was the adult decisions that had wrapped around those last days like a tightening cord. Missed visits, ignored calls, drawn curtains, the small pullback from the world that often signals a household is falling apart from the inside. 11 days. It sounds brief, barely more than a week and a half. But in cases like Ethan's, 11 days is a lifetime. It is long enough for a child's body to weaken, long enough for routines to break, long enough for suffering to deepen beyond what support systems can repair. And yet, those same 11 days were threaded with chances. 2 knocks on a door, a neighbor noticing something strange, a relative waiting for a reply, a worker feeling something was wrong. Chances that, in the haze of everyday life and overburdened systems, slipped through everyone's hands. There are days in an investigation that everyone remembers. The day the phone call comes in, the day the footage surfaces, the day someone finally breaks. But for first responders, the day Ethan collapsed would become one of those moments they could not shake, even years later. Just before noon, the dispatcher's line lit up. A woman's voice came through, flat, disconnected, as if she were reading from a script she barely understood. She didn't begin with a location. She didn't begin with help. She began with a sentence that made the dispatcher sit upright. "My son isn't waking up." The dispatcher asked her to repeat it. Same tone, same emptiness, no urgency, no panic pressing through the handset. In training, they teach dispatchers to listen between words, breathing patterns, hesitation, fear, cluttered noise in the background. This call had none of that. Just a woman speaking as though she were reporting a minor inconvenience. When asked what happened, she paused so long the dispatcher thought the call had dropped. Then Karen finally said, "He just fell." The hesitation alone raised questions the dispatcher couldn't yet name. When the EMT crew from Station 14 pulled up, the first thing they noticed wasn't movement. It was the stillness. Curtains fully drawn in the middle of a bright day. The porch bare. No toys. No shoes left out. No signs of a toddler who should have been running in and out of the doorway. The lead EMT, a black woman with 12 years on the job, later told investigators that she felt something unusual before she even knocked. Inside, the air felt stale, warm, heavy, unmoving. And then, there was the quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that comes not from rest, but from fear. Karen stood in the living room, arms loose at her sides, as if unsure what expression to choose. She didn't rush toward the responders. She didn't lead them to Ethan. She simply pointed toward the hallway. The EMTs exchanged a look. One of those silent professional conversations that only happens in emergencies. They moved quickly. Ethan wasn't on a couch. He wasn't in a crib. He was on the floor, cold laminate under his body, a thin blanket barely covering his legs. The lead EMT knelt beside him first. Her glove touched his arm. It was cooler than it should have been. She called out measurements as her partner prepared equipment. No pulse felt in extremities. Skin dry, lips cracked. Chronic bruising visible before clothing was even moved. And then, when she lifted his shirt, the narrative changes tone, becoming quieter, more solemn. The bruises weren't clustered. They weren't fresh. They told a story across days, maybe weeks. Stripes, finger marks, deep, spreading discoloration along his torso. Her voice wavered, just slightly, when she said, "We need to move now." Not panic, not fear. Urgency born from the kind of scene no one wants to witness. As they carried Ethan out, one EMT stayed behind long enough to glance around the living room. A plate with dried food, a cup half filled, a toddler's shoe under a chair. Signs of a life lived in fragments, not in care. Karen followed them out the door, but didn't ask questions. She didn't ask if he was breathing. She didn't ask if he would survive. When Ethan arrived at the hospital, the trauma team moved fast, gloves snapping, lights adjusted, monitors attached. But within seconds, their movements slowed. Children that young aren't supposed to look like that. A resident stepped back as she counted the injuries. More than 40 visible before imaging even began. Another doctor, the most seasoned in the room, pressed a hand to his own forehead, whispering something under his breath. They saw extreme dehydration, skin tinting, eyes sunken, mouth nearly dry. They saw head trauma, swelling, signs of repeated impact, not a single fall. They saw the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation. One nurse left the room quietly. She didn't return for several minutes. This wasn't a sudden collapse. This wasn't a single mistake. This was a child whose body had been shutting down over days, possibly weeks, and the fight to bring him back was slipping away by the second. The attending physician, a black man with over 20 years in pediatric emergency care, stood over Ethan and absorbed the full picture. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. Children don't end up like this by accident. This was the moment the investigation's tone shifted. The moment Karen's story began to fracture. The moment professionals who had seen almost everything realized they were now looking at something they would never forget. At 8:42 a.m. on August 21st, 2020, less than 24 hours after Ethan was rushed into emergency care, the investigative team gathered inside Conference Room B at the county's Child Protection Unit. The walls were lined with blank case boards waiting to be filled. None of the detectives said it out loud, but everyone in that room already understood. Whatever they uncovered in the next few days would not stay inside these walls. It would follow them home. Detective Cameron Lee sat at the far end of the table, shoulders tight, a legal pad open in front of him. Across from him, the lead forensic pediatrician slid the first folder into the center of the table. It wasn't thick, but it was heavier than anything they had handled in months. The pediatrician began her briefing with a level voice, but she looked down more than she looked up. Ethan's injuries didn't appear random. They followed a pattern, clear enough that even seasoned investigators paused in their notes. Some bruises were fresh, deep purple, and swollen. Others had shifted to yellow and green, injuries at least a week old. And further still, faint brown patches showed where older wounds had already begun fading. Forensic imaging revealed contusions on both arms at consistent grip points, rib compressions likely caused by squeezing, head trauma from 2 separate impacts, abrasions around the wrists that didn't match typical toddler falls, an older fracture to the left clavicle, never medically treated. The pediatrician spoke as though reciting a timeline rather than describing a child's body. Based on the stages of healing, she said, these injuries occurred across several weeks, possibly longer. Detective Lee closed his eyes for a moment, not out of shock, but to let the weight of that data settle. Because timelines like this meant only one thing. Someone was hurting Ethan repeatedly, and someone else was letting it happen. At 9:27 a.m., the hospital dietitian joined the briefing. She placed a single sheet of paper on the table, A nutritional profile, so stark it felt like indictment by itself. Ethan's blood glucose levels were critically low. His stomach contents were minimal. His electrolyte levels suggested sustained dehydration. There were signs of long-term underfeeding, changes that cannot happen in a day or two. The dietitian didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. He was not being fed adequately, she said plainly. This is patterned malnutrition. Patterned, meaning intentional, meaning controlled. Detective Miles circled that word in his notebook, pressing hard enough that the pen nearly tore the page. While forensics unfolded inside the conference room, uniformed officers and child welfare investigators canvassed the neighborhood again, this time with a sharper eye. Several neighbors recalled noise, doors slamming, raised voices, hurried footsteps late at night. One neighbor mentioned seeing Michael pacing the backyard with an object in his hand. Another remembered the children rarely being outside anymore. Then came the interviews inside the home. Shanice sat at the end of her parents' living room couch, her hands clasped tightly as she answered questions with statements that felt memorized. She insisted Ethan bruised easily. She insisted he ate fine. She insisted she never saw anything alarming. But when detectives shifted topics, asking about Ethan's last full meal, a specific date in early August, or the unexplained marks on his ribs, her answers slid into contradictions. She first said she fed him breakfast, then said she wasn't home that morning, then said she couldn't remember. Detective Lee noted every inconsistency. Karen's interview followed. She sat further on the edge of her seat, arms crossed, as though bracing herself. Her answers drifted, wandering from topic to topic, never landing on anything specific. When asked why she delayed calling for help the day Ethan collapsed, she paused for a full 8 seconds, the kind of pause that makes investigators lean in. Her eventual answer, "I didn't think it was that serious at first," felt empty even to her own ears. But the turning point came when detectives asked directly, "Has Michael ever harmed Ethan?" Karen looked down. Her breath quickened. She swallowed hard, but she said nothing. It wasn't denial. It was silence, the kind that reveals more than words. By late afternoon, detectives Lee and Miles moved into the digital review room. 6 monitors, time-stamped footage, and enough data to drown a lesser team. They began logging behavior patterns. 5:12 a.m., a shadow pacing through the yard. 10:46 a.m., older siblings laughing near the porch while Ethan's faint cries came from inside. 3:02 p.m., Michael stepping outside alone, wiping his face with a hand that shook. 8:21 p.m., Karen sitting on the porch, staring at the yard, motionless for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing explicitly violent in these clips, but all of it hinted at tension, dread, strain. Then, on footage from July 29th, the moment that shifted the investigation's trajectory, they found what would later be labeled Event 7A. Michael stepping into the yard, carrying an object close to his chest, not cradling it, not supporting it, holding it. The zoomed-in enhancement revealed it was Ethan, his body limp, his head resting against Michael's forearm at an unnatural angle. Detective Miles didn't look away. Detective Lee leaned forward, jaw clenched. This footage didn't show the injury itself. No strike, no impact. But it showed the aftermath. And sometimes, aftermath tells more truth than action. At 6:38 p.m., after 8 straight hours of footage review, Detective Lee said the words that formally transformed the case. "This isn't neglect anymore." Miles looked at him. Lee continued, "This is a pattern. Coordinated. Repeated. Someone imposed control over this child." It was the first time the investigators labeled the case not as child welfare failure, but as systematic abuse. Even for a seasoned unit, the emotional strain became visible. One detective stopped taking lunch breaks, saying he couldn't bring himself to eat while reviewing starvation patterns. Another admitted he couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. Detective Miles stepped out during a briefing and stayed in the hallway longer than he meant to. Lee didn't confront him. He simply placed a hand on the doorway and said, "Take your time," because everyone in that unit understood. Cases involving children rewrite the emotional rules. This one was rewriting them page by page. By the second day of interviews, the detectives could feel the weight of the house pressing down on them. It wasn't the peeling paint or the cluttered rooms. They had seen that before, but the tension, the careful calibrations of every word spoken by those inside. Every answer was a test, every pause a potential clue, and the truth was hiding between the lines. Michael sat rigidly, shoulders squared, his hands clasped in front of him. 15 years on the force had taught Detective Cameron Lee to recognize a practiced calm. But Michael's calm was different. There was no flicker of guilt, no slip of conscience. He described his interactions with Ethan in precise, measured tones. Every word was intentional, as though rehearsed for a courtroom rather than a police interview. Yet, behind the eyes, there was a detachment that made even veteran officers uneasy. His body language contradicted his words, the slight tension in his jaw, the brief clenching of fists, tiny cracks in the mask he wore. Karen, in contrast, shifted constantly in her chair. Her hands twisted in her lap, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. Yet when pressed, she quickly redirected attention elsewhere. One moment she described trying to comfort Ethan. The next she blamed a sibling for causing trouble. Her speech oscillated between sorrow and deflection, as if navigating an invisible tightrope between truth and self-preservation. Every word carried the faint echo of fear, guilt, and denial, creating an impression of fragility, masking complicity. Shanice, barely 22, was caught in the crossfire of her own remorse and confusion. Her voice trembled as she recounted believing Ethan was safe with his grandparents. She admitted to feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope, but simultaneously shifted responsibility elsewhere. Every statement came with hesitation, every glance down or away a silent admission. She knew, at some level, something was deeply wrong. Investigators began mapping the contradictions. On August 4th, Michael claimed Ethan had breakfast and a snack before school, but hospital records, combined with sibling statements, revealed he had gone hours without sufficient food. Karen insisted she had watched over him constantly, yet CCTV footage from the same day captured Ethan isolated in the garden, enduring stress positions under the blazing sun. Shanice said she checked in regularly, but social services logs showed missed appointments and closed doors. The detectives worked meticulously, cross-referencing timelines, medical reports, health visitor logs, school reports, CCTV footage, and household interviews. Each inconsistency became a thread, a point where reality diverged from narrative. These threads, when woven together, revealed a grim pattern: deliberate neglect, calculated avoidance, and emotional suppression, acts that were small individually but lethal collectively. The interview room itself seemed to press in. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the scratch of pen on notebook paper, the occasional cough, all contrasted with the emotional storm beneath the surface. Detective Lee noticed the faint smell of perfume mixing with the sterile odor of the room, a sensory imprint that would stay with him. The detectives were not just gathering evidence. They were absorbing the psychological weight of every word, every pause, every hesitation. Even small details mattered. When asked about the bruises discovered on Ethan's back, Michael stiffened, his eyes briefly flicking toward Karen before he responded. Karen's shoulders slumped when asked if she had intervened. Shanice's lip trembled as she tried to explain her belief that he was fine. These micro-reactions were as significant as the physical evidence. They revealed guilt, complicity, and a fractured family dynamic that had allowed a toddler's suffering to escalate unchecked. The investigators also grappled with the psychological complexity. No single motive emerged. There was no financial gain, no revenge, no substance abuse driving these acts. The cruelty was normalized, almost bureaucratic, embedded in a household structure that valued obedience over empathy, routine over care, and control over warmth. Each interview exposed not just inconsistencies in testimony, but the underlying ethos that permitted abuse to flourish in plain sight. Hours stretched into days. The detectives reviewed recordings, compared statements, and pieced together a narrative that the family was unwilling or unable to articulate. The tension was unrelenting. Every contradiction heightened the stakes. Every evasive answer hinted at further unseen horrors. And yet, within these contradictions, glimmers of acknowledgement began to emerge. A twitch, a downward glance, a momentary lapse of composure. Tiny windows into the truth hidden beneath layers of denial. For the officers, the emotional toll was significant. Detective Lee later admitted that even after decades on the force, these interviews left marks. It's not just the evidence, he said. It's seeing how people justify what should never be justified. It sticks with you. And for the team, the realization was sobering. Uncovering the inconsistencies wasn't just about building a case. It was about reconstructing a life that had been systematically diminished and, ultimately, destroyed. As the last interview concluded, the room emptied, leaving silence heavy and oppressive. The detectives knew the next step was critical. Every contradiction documented, every micro-expression noted, every evasive answer recorded would be cross-examined against the evidence. They were now holding the threads of a web spun with deliberate care. But they also knew that following those threads would lead to revelations so damning they could never be unseen. The morning of June 7, 2025, the Flintshire Crown Court seemed heavier than usual. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, cutting across rows of polished benches. Inside, the air was thick, not with heat, but with anticipation, fear, and the unspoken weight of what was about to be revealed. The case of 2-year-old Ethan Ives Griffiths was about to be laid bare, piece by devastating piece. Prosecutor Nicola Rees, a veteran with more than 30 years in the courtroom, had prepared for cases of child abuse before. She had seen neglect, cruelty, and tragedy. But even her seasoned mind recoiled as she replayed the CCTV footage once more before entering the courtroom. There, Ethan was carried across the yard by one arm, held in stress positions under the sun, and forced to endure humiliation at the hands of his grandparents. Each frame was a small portrait of horror, and yet it was only a fraction of what had happened behind closed doors. As the proceedings began, Nicole noticed the subtle reactions of the accused. Michael Ives sat rigid, expression cold, rarely blinking, hands clasped in front of him as if his body alone could contain the weight of what was coming. Karen Ives shifted constantly, eyes darting toward the jurors, lips pressed tightly together, a tremor in her hand betraying the tension she tried to mask. Shanice Ives, Ethan's mother, alternated between staring blankly at the table and furtively glancing at her parents, her body language a mixture of shame, confusion, and fear. Each movement told a story that words alone could not convey. The courtroom itself became a stage for shock and disbelief. Forensic doctors, experts in child injury, were called first. They recounted, in painstaking detail, the medical examination conducted when Ethan was found. The child was emaciated, dehydrated, and covered in over 40 separate injuries. Bruises in varying stages of healing, abrasions on delicate skin, and the catastrophic brain trauma that ultimately claimed his life. Each statement was measured, but the strain was visible. One doctor, struggling to maintain composure, excused himself from the witness stand, hands shaking, as tears ran silently down his face. Another paused mid-sentence, inhaling sharply, before continuing to describe the meticulously documented injuries. Even those trained to face trauma daily were unprepared for this level of cruelty. The jury listened intently, some leaning forward in disbelief, others with hands clasped over their mouths, absorbing evidence that defied logic. By mid-morning, it was clear the case would leave a permanent mark. Judge Griffiths, recognizing the severity and graphic nature of the testimony, formally excused the jurors from ever having to serve again, acknowledging that no one should carry the burden of these images more than necessary. As Nicole presented the sequence of events, she layered the evidence meticulously. Footage from August 4th showed Michael, Ives carrying Ethan across the yard. August 10th revealed him forcing Ethan into prolonged stress positions while encouraging an older sibling to strike him. Social worker logs, previously overlooked, were read aloud, highlighting missed opportunities for intervention, the delays, the excuses, and the quiet neglect that allowed Ethan's suffering to escalate. Every detail, every timestamp, every report, connected like pieces of a puzzle too horrific to assemble in the real world. Detective Cameron Lee, who had spent hundreds of hours reviewing CCTV footage, sat quietly in the courtroom. He had expected to feel relief that the investigation had led to justice, but relief was mingled with an enduring grief. Watching the case unfold in court, hearing witnesses recount the same horrors he had already seen, the detective felt the full weight of failure. Not his, but the systemic cracks that allowed a toddler to endure such prolonged torment. Outside the courtroom, whispers of the case spread quickly. Social workers who had been on Ethan's case watched from the gallery, their expressions taut, remembering doors left closed, calls unanswered, and visits interrupted. For them, each testimony reopened wounds that had never fully healed, and each detail reminded them of the life that could have been saved. Through the day, the prosecution navigated each emotional beat carefully, avoiding sensationalism while exposing the deliberate inaction and cruelty of the adults entrusted with Ethan's care. Every witness, every piece of evidence, created a layered narrative. The small, almost invisible steps that led to tragedy, the deception, the neglect, and the unbroken chain of missed chances. The courtroom became a mirror reflecting society's failure to protect its most vulnerable. By late afternoon, the emotional toll was undeniable. Journalists noted the silence in the room when Michael Ives gave his testimony, his words calculated, tone flat. Karen's sobs punctuated the pauses between witnesses. Shanice's hand shook as she wrote notes, her eyes brimming, reflecting a mother's helplessness and regret. And throughout it all, the jury bore witness, absorbing each moment with the knowledge that justice demanded both understanding and judgment. Everyone in that courtroom, professionals, family, law enforcement, and the public, was confronted with a singular truth. Ethan Ives Griffith's life was brutally taken, and while the law would now weigh responsibility, nothing could undo the magnitude of his suffering. Yet, in the midst of despair, a fragile thread of hope remained. Accountability was finally within reach. It was Monday, June 15th, 2025, a day that would be etched in memory for everyone inside Courtroom 3 of Flintshire Crown Court. The polished wooden panels reflected the soft morning light streaming through the tall windows. Outside, the city stirred with its usual rhythm, unaware that inside, the story of Ethan Ives Griffiths would unfold in a way that would leave professionals, people hardened by decades of crime work, speechless. Prosecutor Nicola Rees, African-American, with over 30 years in the courtroom, arrived early. She had prepared for months, but no preparation could have shielded her from what she was about to witness. Sitting at the front, reviewing her notes, she paused over the CCTV footage yet again. Each frame, each small movement of Ethan, each act of cruelty replayed like a repeated echo of heartbreak. I've seen a lot, she later reflected, but nothing prepared me for this. The courtroom gradually filled. Family members, social workers, journalists, and neighbors, each bringing their own silent weight of expectation. The jurors, handpicked with care, faced their first glimpse of the evidence. For them, this was more than an ordinary case. It was a window into a life destroyed behind closed doors, a life that should have been protected. Then the footage began. Ethan, just 2 years old, appeared on the screen. He was small, fragile, and alone, moved about like an object rather than a child. Michael Ives's hands gripped him tightly. Karen Ives stood nearby, silent. Each frame revealed hours of maltreatment and emotional neglect, subtle acts that added up to something devastating. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some swallowed hard. Others looked away, unable to meet the horror unfolding before them. Doctors and medical professionals called to testify were equally shaken. Years of experience could not prepare them for the catalog of injuries Ethan endured. One pediatrician, after detailing the extent of physical trauma, paused, stepped out of the courtroom, and took a deep breath. Another left to collect herself before continuing. Even in the sterile, controlled environment of the courtroom, human emotion could not be suppressed. Professionals reduced to tears, not from weakness, but from the sheer impossibility of reconciling the evidence with a child's brief life. Nicola Rees, sitting stoically, replayed key segments in her mind. She had to anticipate the questions of the defense, prepare the witnesses, and navigate a courtroom that was emotionally charged at every corner. Each piece of evidence was carefully presented: timelines, food records, CCTV stills, testimonies from social workers who had struggled to reach Ethan, and observations from neighbors who had only glimpsed fragments of his reality. The prosecution built a tapestry of abuse that was painstakingly thorough, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. The judge, Mr. Justice Griffiths, addressed the jurors directly. Given the distressing nature of the evidence, I must excuse you from ever being called for jury duty again. What you are about to witness is beyond the ordinary. His words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the gravity of the case. The jurors understood that their decisions would carry immense weight, not just legally, but morally and emotionally. As the trial progressed, subtle patterns of abuse were drawn out with clinical precision. Experts describe how a child's small body could endure only so much. They detailed the psychological impact of repeated humiliation, the physical toll of starvation, dehydration, and relentless physical punishment. Even the most seasoned professionals were forced to confront a reality they had never imagined. Outside the public gallery, social workers whispered quietly to one another, reflecting on missed visits, unanswered doors, and the procedural gaps that had allowed this tragedy to unfold. They carried the invisible burden of guilt and responsibility, questions that would linger long after the gavel fell. And yet, amid the sorrow and despair, there was a sense of profound duty. Nicola Rees and the team of investigators knew that telling Ethan's story with precision, clarity, and honesty was itself a form of justice. They could not bring him back, but they could ensure that the truth was seen, heard, and recorded forever. The chapter of the courtroom closed each day with silent contemplation. Every witness, every piece of footage, every word spoken contributed to a cumulative understanding of cruelty and negligence. For the jurors, the weight of what they were seeing was tangible. They were not simply judging the law. They were bearing witness to the stolen life of a child. Even seasoned detectives admitted later that they had replayed certain moments in their minds long after leaving the courthouse. The emotional resonance of the trial was such that the jury would be forced to carry its burden carefully, balancing professional duty with human compassion. For everyone involved, the courtroom became more than a room of legal procedure. It became a mirror reflecting society's failure to protect its most vulnerable, and a reminder of the stakes when oversight fails. Detective Cameron Lee, 15 years on the force, sits in his quiet apartment, the city's evening hum barely filtering through the blinds. For years, he thought he had a thick skin. But Ethan's case, the 2-year-old beaten, starved, and left to die, left a permanent scar. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees the boy's small, frail body and the backyard where abuse unfolded.